Hey, I'm here with Representative Greg Canfield today from Vestavia, Alabama, and we are going to talk about some of the legislation that he has in this year's session. I know that you have a budget bill this session, and I was going to see if you would just kind of explain to people how the budgeting process works currently first,
okay,
and then we'll talk about what your bill does.
Sure, Brooklyn. I mean, today when the legislature budgets for education, it requires that a forecast be made of revenues for the revenue change from the current year to the future year. The problem with that is that the revenues that make up the revenues to fund the education budget happen to be the most volatile types of revenues that you might expect. They're made up of sales tax, and they're made up of income tax from personal and business income taxes. So as you might expect, when there are changes in the economy, there are also changes in those levels of revenues, and they can change drastically from one year to the next, sometimes as much as 17% change in the level of revenue increase or decrease from one year to the next. So we build a budget based on that forecast or that guess. And when we build a budget based on an overly optimistic forecast, we oftentimes end up having to cut the budget once it's been passed, and that's called proration.
Okay. Now explain what your bill is, the Rolling Reserve Budget Act, and explain what it does and how it's going to work and make the budgeting process better.
Sure. That bill has actually been pre-filed as House Bill 99 for the current session. The way the Rolling Reserve Budget Act works is that it helps to eliminate that guesswork that's involved with estimating revenue changes from one year to the next. And it does that by simply saying that we recognize that there's a highly volatile revenue component in the budget. So let's take the volatility out of that revenue component by using long-term averages which smooth out all of the ups and downs and make it more of a steady growth pattern with very little change, because you've used a long-term, in this case 15-year average. So that 15-year average of growth then becomes the cap, the maximum that we can budget for that next year in the education budget. Now we'll still take revenue estimates, and we can still pass a budget based on revenue estimates, but we can't pass it any higher than that cap that is established. Now the beautiful thing about rolling reserve budgeting is that once you set up your budget, in those years when you have really good economic times and revenues exceed the budget, then those monies go into a savings account called the Budget Stabilization Fund, so that in those years when you have a bad economy, and we've seen that a lot, you have a savings account, the Budget Stabilization Fund, from which you can draw to prevent proration. Preventing proration in Alabama, especially in education, is important because we found that historically, for every 10 budgets we pass, 3 of those 10 budgets end up being prorated. We've got about 1 million students in Alabama, and if you look at those 1 million students, if one of those students enters our public school systems at kindergarten and completes 4 years of college, they are very likely to have experienced proration, a cut in their school's budget, 5 times, and that's unacceptable.
Right. Well, that just sounds like smart business practices and smart, more fiscal responsibility. I don't know anybody, I would think, who would disagree with that, who manages a family budget. What are the obstacles to getting your bill passed in the legislature this time?
Well, the obstacles are that no one easily accepts a new idea, at least politically.
Right.
And so the opposition that we're seeing will come from, it'll come from primarily those who have been chairing committees or have been involved in the education budget committees for some time and are accustomed to budgeting under the current method, and perhaps they've also made some attempts to, along the way, to pass statutes that were designed to reduce the likelihood of proration. And so they're going to be more resistant to a new approach like this. However, We look at public schools across the state, and the Alabama Association of School Boards, the Superintendents of Alabama's Association, the Higher Education Partnership. In other words, K through 12 schools and leaders in the local school districts love this idea of rolling reserve budgeting. And it is highly unusual to have K through 12 and higher education in agreement on a process, and they both agree that rolling reserve budgeting gives them stability that they've been searching for quite some time.
Okay. Well, what can people do to help you? I mean, if I'm sitting at home and I think you have a good idea, what can I do to make sure it gets passed?
The best thing they can do is don't write me. They need to write their legislator in both the House and the Senate. And particularly, if they want to really help, they can take the time to write or email the committee chairman of the House Education Appropriations Committee and the Senate Education Appropriations Committee, because they need to know that there's popular support for this idea back home.
Okay.